And so moving on in Kant here to the second half of the discussion of the sublime, on the dynamically sublime in nature, which is to say the other two categories, those of relation and modality. He says that if nature is to be judged by us as dynamically sublime, then it must be represented as exciting fear of some sort. So for the dynamically sublime has to do with great power, the almightiness of nature, earthquakes and hurricanes and volcanoes, the raging sea, the stormy sky, all this imagery that you get, for example, in King Lear, let's say. That's all the imagery of the sublime power of nature, and it excites in us fear, not, however, terror or real fear. It's a kind of the kind of fear that the sublime evokes in us is a purified kind of fear. It's a fear of the imagination, or a fear that is experienced vicariously by means of the activity of the imagination. It's not actual fear, because Kant says that you can't derive any sort of satisfaction from actual fear, from a state of you're fearing for your life. That's a different kind of fear than the kind of respectful, awful fear of man in possession, or coming up against the impact of the great almightiness of nature. Or it's a little bit like the monsters in the short stories of H.P. Lovecraft. At least I always get this feeling. I think those stories are a classic example of this type of sublimity that Kant is talking about here, when he has his protagonists uncover the ruins of these ancient alien civilizations, exactly as in the movie Alien, by the way, which is inspired by Lovecraft, originally Lovecraft stories, where, for example, the Mountains of Madness, and they go down in beneath the Antarctic ice cap, and they find this alien civilization, and you get the sense of these gigantic alien beings that were the gods at one point. They were mistaken for gods, but they're really these alien beings. And you really do feel a sense from Lovecraft's stories of the sublime, this kind of cosmic fear that there might be beings that are larger and more intelligent than us, who regard us merely as playthings. And so this is also bound up with religious awe, too, as Kant says, the fear of the gods. It's not just the fear of nature, but it's also the fear of God. Although it's a respectful fear, it's a fear that is bound up with a certain amount of esteem for the deity, otherwise it degenerates into mere superstition. The uncultivated man, or the man who merely is afraid of his deity, who will punish him for some imagined offense, is merely bound to superstition. But true religious awe has a certain type of esteem and respect and reverence tied up with the fear of the almightiness of the deity, to which we submit. In all the world's religions, we signify our submission through different kinds of bowing in one manner or another, praying, bowing, and so forth. Those are all forms of submission to the sublimity of the greatness of the deity. And so notice, too, here that with regard to these emotions, like as he says here, that the sublime is not real terror, it's not real fear, that both the beautiful and the sublime, the way Kant presents them here, are not, they're both manifestations of fear and desire. The beautiful is a disinterested pleasure, but it degenerates into mere desire when there is a want for the object, when there's an interest in possessing the object represented, as in the desire for the beautiful woman, let's say, or the child's desire for the chocolate bar. Those are interested desires. Same thing with fear here. Fear has been purified into a kind of calm, contemplative imagination of fear. And so it's not pure fear and desire. And this is also why Schopenhauer, I think, came along and saw that Kantian aesthetics was eminently compatible with Buddhism, since in Buddhism, the basic motive forces of the human being are kinetic. We're either motivated by desire for objects, or fear of them, or fear of losing them. But fear and desire are the main kinetic motivations, the only release from which possible in Buddhism is not aesthetic contemplation, at least not in early Hinayana Buddhism, but through the attainment of nirvana, the absolute stasis that is a state of immobility, complete indifference to these kinetic emotions. So Schopenhauer noticed the similarity of the structure of that with the Kantian aesthetic here, in which the beautiful and the sublime are basically desire and fear purified by art into disinterested desire or pleasure, disinterested pleasure, and a calm contemplative fear, a respectful awe. And that became for him, he saw art as a kind of equivalent to nirvana for the West, the arrest of the will in the momentary contemplation where the beholding eye becomes the pure eye of the universe, beholding the pure thing of the universe, and there is no kind of interested or kinetic relationship between them. That's the Schopenhauerian aesthetic that is derived from this Kantian aesthetic. And so that's the dynamical sublime, and that's Kant plugging the aesthetic contemplation of the sublime into the category of relation. Then he moves on to plug it into the fourth category, that of modality. Whereas last time with the beautiful, he had said that when he had plugged the aesthetic judgments regarding the beautiful into the category of modality, of necessity, that the necessity rested upon the observation that everyone else ought to find as beautiful that which I find beautiful, presupposing that I have taste, on the presupposition that there is a common sense that is shared by all, anyone that is who has taste, anyone who has cultivated a certain amount of taste. And so likewise with the sublime, Kant says here that the sublime also results from necessity, but the necessity in this case is grounded upon the presupposition of a certain degree of cultivation amongst other people, not so much common sense, but of cultivation, because he who is capable of recognizing the sublime has a certain degree of receptivity to ideas that the dull individual does not. The peasant regards, let's say, the catastrophes of nature merely as terrible, merely as awful. He doesn't see the beauty in them, the sublimity, rather, in them. He doesn't see the aesthetic aspect to them. And the same thing as we saw with the uncultivated man with regard to religion, who merely sees it as he regards it as something that will punish him, and he leads his life in abject fear of that kind of punishment. There's a lack of cultivation there. And likewise, Kant says, when we say of somebody who does not agree with our judgment of the beautiful thing in nature that he's lacking in taste, likewise we also say that if he does not agree with our an analysis or estimation of the sublime in nature, we say that he has no feeling. There's a want of moral sense there. And so there's an inability to appreciate the sublime in that aspect. Then he makes a set of general remarks on, he says that in reference to the feeling of pleasure, an object is to be classified either as pleasant, beautiful, sublime, or good. And we already saw the analysis of the beautiful in connection with the pleasant and the good. The pleasant is mere sensation, having nothing to do with concepts. It's common even to animals. Whereas the good has precisely to do with concepts. And in between them we have the beautiful and the sublime. Neither one has anything to do with purpose or with concepts, but simply with the capacity of experiencing aesthetic contemplation. And so here he connects each one of these with these modes of pleasure, connects with the four categories, which is his obsession. He's always connecting everything back with the four categories. And so with regard to the category of quantity, he connects the pleasant, insofar as the pleasant rests upon the amount of pleasures that are derived, the amount of charms, and therefore is connected with quantity. He connects the beautiful then with quality, since it has to do with disinterested pleasure, the pleasurable, that's a quality. Then he connects the sublime with the category of relation, since the sublime has to do with the estimation of the relation of the power of nature to the human being. And then finally, with regard to the category of modality, specifically that of the three. Remember, modality was possibility, actuality, necessity. In this case, it's necessity that he's interested in for modality. And connects it with the absolute good. The absolute good is connected with necessity by means of concepts, a priori concepts, such as ideas of purpose and utility and what a thing is for and so forth. So he connects those four modes of the pleasurable to the four categories. And then he goes on in the chapter to analyze certain kinds of emotions and to classify them as either sublime or beautiful. And he talks about how, for example, wrath is a form of the sublime. It's a sublime emotion. But so is despair, he says. Any kind of strenuous emotion. Enthusiasm is a sublime emotion. Despair is also a sublime emotion as long as it is motivated by a kind of wrathful indignation and not by a merely pathetic form of sympathy or self-pity. That belongs to what he calls one of the languid emotions, which are pathetic. And so then he talks about some of these other emotions like sentimentality, he says, is worthless. Sentimentality is just tender emotions. They have no worth insofar as the beautiful and the sublime, and so forth and so on. So you get a sense of, and the religious emotion obviously is the great sublime emotion. And then he finishes up, and then in the next section we'll move on to the deduction of the pure aesthetical judgments.